love that I never felt. That really helped me rise above, to fly above all the hell of this world, to ascend to what they call divine love. I felt a level of love that I never felt. That really helped me rise above, to fly above all the hell of this world, to ascend to what they call divine love. Life is a trip and I'm running quick. That I'm on my conscious tip. That love is the currency and I'm earning it. I work for my consciousness to put into practice what we all preach. To even love all the spiders, all the creeps. To be wiser to teach. What you put out is what you can get back, or what you put in is what you can put out. I felt a level of love that I never felt. That really helped me rise above, to fly above all the hell of this world, to ascend to what they call divine love. I felt a level of love that I never felt. That really helped me rise above, to fly above all the hell of this world, to ascend to what they call divine love. I feel a level of love that I always feel. That helps me be real and rise above, to fly above all the pain and heal. To be really here for divine love. I hope to always feel all the love that I feel in all of my years to come. And I'm never surrounded to all the fear and be here for divine love. Divine love, divine love, divine love, 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 love. Divine love, divine love, divine love, 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 love. I felt a level of love that I never felt. That really helped me rise above, to fly above all the hell of this world, to ascend to what they call divine love. I felt a level of love that I never felt. That really helped me rise above, to fly above all the hell of this world, to ascend to what they call divine love. I feel a level of love that I always feel. That helps me be real and rise above, to fly above all the pain and heal. To be really here for divine love. I hope to always feel all the love that I feel in all of my years to come. And I'm never surrounded to all the fear and be here for divine love. I hope to continue this relationship until the end, when we finally meet each other spirit to spirit and hold each other's non-physical hands. To be truly spiritual and not a limited man, to bathe in divine love that is unlimited from a pair of loving parents. Love your loving parents, your mother and your father, Mother Earth and Father Sky. I felt a level of love that I never felt. That really helped me rise above, to fly above all the hell of this world, to ascend to what they call divine love. I felt a level of love that I never felt. That really helped me rise above, to fly above all the hell of this world, to ascend to what they call divine love. I've always been here and there, and I will be there for you in the end. To hold each other's hands and share the love that comes from loving parents. I hope to always feel all the love that I feel in all of my years to come. And I'm never surrounded to all the fear and be here for divine love.
You're listening to Citizens Talk Radio, your voice for a better world.
Be afraid. Be very afraid. For the socialists are invading our proud republic. They have infested their ideas throughout the public education system. They have infiltrated the halls of Congress, and, according to some, they have even captured the White House. They have mobilized a coalition to defund our police and radically reform the criminal justice system. Thanks to socialists, the language of radicalism, with words such as woke and social justice, are seeping into the mainstream of our nation's discourse. Yes, socialism is overtaking the promise of our inherently capitalistic government, endangering our freedoms, robbing us of our potential, and threatening the very fabric upon which this nation was built. Look, I won't try to deny it. We socialists are not only here right now, but we have been here all along. For those who might run and cower from the shadow of socialism, I say once again, be afraid. Be very afraid. Because the socialism you so greatly fear has been integral to our nation since its conception. Many of America's socialist roots have been suppressed from our history as the myth of our capitalistic founding has masterfully woven itself in place and denounced the vilified name of socialism. In truth, even some far-right Republicans regularly espouse socialist ideas. They praise socialists of the past and even pledge their allegiance to a socialist pen manifesto. The Pledge of Allegiance that inspired call to patriotism that so many right-wing Tea Party Republicans chant with such fervor, that's right, was authored by a Christian socialist. The song, America the Beautiful, is another beloved symbol of our patriotism that was similarly penned by a socialist thinker and anti-imperialist who endlessly campaigned for social and economic justice. This Land is Your Land, another anthem included on most 4th of July playlists, was in fact written by an avid crusader for socialist values. Even the sonnet inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, with the famous line about "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," was composed by a wealthy woman who had radical ideas about economic equality and joined socialists to advocate for impoverished immigrants. On the political landscape, Thomas Paine, the founding father, praised by liberals and conservatives alike, is in many ways considered the father of socialist thinking and was himself a radical socialist. President Abraham Lincoln was a socialist thinker and radical actor. In fact, the very roots of the Republican Party were born from a socialist movement. Again and again, throughout our great arc of our nation's history, at every critical juncture, celebrated heroes of history have provoked and influenced our republic in a more progressive and socialist direction. The abolition of slavery, that was a socialist movement, as was in many ways the Revolutionary War itself that gave birth to our nation. If the core ideas of a socialistic society have been so prevalent through America's history, I have to ask, why does the word socialism strike a chord of distaste, disharmony, and even treason to the ear of the average citizen on the street? Why? Because not only has our nation's socialist heritage been disguised from the pages of history, but the word socialist itself has become bastardized so far from its original meaning. In today's episode of Coup Save America, we will probe the depths of socialism to better understand what it is, what it entails, and most importantly, what it is not. Socialism, as defined by Richard Wolff in his book Socialism, explains that socialism is a kind of yearning for a better life than what capitalism permits for most people. Wolff's definition of socialism is far more aligned with the majority of those who embrace socialism. It's not necessarily a yearning for any socialist-run state of the past, but rather it's a yearning for something that is more just, more equal, and simply better than what we have now. Richard Wolff goes on to say, any serious discussion of socialism must begin by acknowledging socialism's rich diversity. Whatever particular aspects of socialism we choose to analyze, they need to be located within socialism's complexity. That avoids presenting one's own interpretation as if it were the entirety of socialism. In other words, socialism is not a singularly defined economic system. There are many different forms and ideas surrounding socialism. Most of the people who lean towards socialism aren't thinking about a specific framework of government. They are merely yearning for better lives in a more equitable society. It is the same yearning that is echoed across the passage of human history. It's a desire for more freedom and more control over our lives, in contrast to the bondage of slavery, debt, injustice, and other forms of oppression. In many ways, these yearnings embrace the same principle that are held by most of the people who favor capitalism. The controversy of socialism is not so much the concepts the movement represents, but in the way the word itself has been so heavily politicized that it conjures up negative associations for people who have been conditioned against the term. For example, when a conservative hears mention of Medicare for all, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Socialism. And through that word association, any constructive discussion on the topic becomes impossible. Instead of acknowledging the problems within our current healthcare system, then debating the merits and legitimate criticisms surrounding a single-payer system, the conversation becomes centered around the evils of socialism versus capitalism. Too many of the problems and issues of our society have become entrapped in political language, where the common denominator, or at least that which is perceived, becomes entirely political in nature. Climate change is another example. When conservatives hear the mention of climate change, they associate it with liberals and then perceive a threat or blame. The facts of climate change are ignored, leading to denial on the basis that climate change is purely a front for liberals to impose a socialist agenda. There is simply no room for compromise discourse when creating solutions to the problems that affect us gets turned into a battle of good versus evil. This confusion of language, meaning, and associative mental framework is no mistake. Politicians have a long history of polluting constructive conversation by exploiting the public's tendencies to be superficial and short-sighted. It is a strategic form of social control that fosters biases and restricts ideas. The mainstream debate about socialism and capitalism are largely occurring within a vacuum of ignorance, misconceptions, and outright lies. In the opening of his 1904 presidential campaign on the socialist ticket, Eugene Victor Debs told his supporters, "Ignorance alone stands in the way of socialist success. The capitalist parties understand this and use their resources to prevent the workers from seeing the light. Intellectual darkness is essential to industrial slavery," adding, "The very moment a workman begins to do his own thinking, he understands the paramount issue, parts company with a capitalist politician, and falls in line with his own classes on the political battlefield." Debs understood the way ignorance is so readily weaponized, and he knew how people in power would be astute in their efforts to keep everyday citizens ignorant and divided. The rejection of socialism in the United States was first prompted by tensions that emerged during the Cold War as fears of communism spread. But the levels of extremism over socialism have continued throughout as the result of politicians, corporations, and the elite ruling class vilifying the term for their own gain. Socialism is weaponized by the ruling class as a means of undermining the need for robust social services and policies that benefit the whole of society, and to rationalize legitimate surveillance of marginalized people that are seen as a threat to the existing power structures. In a battle to keep citizens confused about the real threats to their well-being, the Tuttle twins are our most adorable and yet most disturbing warriors. Emily and Ethan are a pair of fictional young siblings who are the protagonists of books and cartoons, designed to teach children the concepts of economics and government that they aren't learning in school. These animated adventures seem like a wonderful way to jumpstart a child's understanding of complex concepts, until we realize that this educational entertainment is published by the Liberatus Institute, a right-wing libertarian think tank based in Utah that champions banning books from schools while also lobbying attacks against the so-called radical left for infringing Americans' freedoms. To listen to the Tuttle twins, the Democratic Party has been taken over by an unapologetic socialist intent upon thrusting socialism down the throats of all Americans. Each volume in the Tuttle twins library is based on the teachings of a prominent intellectual of the libertarian right, and the bad guys of the stories are characters who threaten individual rights or the free market. What nobody ever explains to the Tuttle twins is why the post office, the military, along with the police and fire departments, are somehow exempt from being labeled as socialism. These are, after all, major entitlement programs which are publicly funded and for the benefit of all the people. America is not and was never a socialist nation, but we must firmly recognize the socialist threads which have been woven into the tapestry of our proud republic. While the common sense benefits of such programs seem obvious, they lose their appeal when certain people, the right, slap them with the label of socialism. In 1952, President Harry Truman noted that socialism is the epithet they hurled at every advance people have made in the last 20 years. The president went on to say socialism is what they call public power, Social Security, bank deposit insurance, free and independent labor organizations, anything that helps all the people. Truman concluded by noting when the Republican candidate inscribes the slogan "Down with Socialism," what he really means is down with progress. Just as the true meaning of the term socialism has been lost in the political language of the day, so have the core concepts of capitalism, an economic system that is by no means inherently evil. Adam Smith, the forefather of capitalist thinking, conceived of an economic and political theory upon which his chief assumption was that humans are self-serving by nature, but so long as each individual were able to seek fulfillment of their own self-interest, the material needs of the whole society would be satisfactorily met. While he never used the term capitalism to describe his theory, choosing instead the phrase commercial society, Smith's theory paved the way to the capitalist society we find in the present. Smith believed that unrestricted competition by way of the free market would liberate society from the deprivations of mercantilism. If, for instance, a neighborhood baker was to charge $10 for a loaf of bread, well, he would not get away with such price gouging so long as another baker would be willing to sell his bread at a more reasonable price. The tendency for competition to keep the prices of goods and services in line with the needs of consumers was regarded by Smith as the invisible hand of the market. He imagined that such a free market approach would eliminate the need for governments and outside forces to interfere or regulate the market. By all accounts, Adam Smith would be appalled by the current construct of the free market. Smith had a remarkable disdain for monopolies, and he would likely express utter contempt for the major corporations that operate throughout the modern world today. Today, we only have the illusion of choice, and the invisible hand of the market seems to have been amputated as punishment for stealing from the rich to give to the poor. In the United States, the richest 1% own 34% of the wealth, while the richest 10% own 74% of the wealth. The Economist magazine reports that over the 15-year period from 1997 to 2012, 2/3 of American industries were concentrated in the hands of a few firms. And I'm sure that these figures have not improved over the past decade. As you can well imagine, U.S. corporations play a major role in accelerating anti-socialist sentiments. So what are the mechanisms within capitalism that exacerbate these inequalities of income and wealth? Capitalism, sadly, has always built itself on historically inherited inequalities of class, ethnicity, and gender. Those individuals who have found success in a capitalistic society bear children who are given the assets and opportunities they need to succeed themselves, while the offspring of the impoverished lack the resources to get ahead. To counter this simple and flagrant inequality of birth, American culture has created the myth of the self-made billionaire, from John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, entrepreneurs of the Gilded Age, to the industry giants of today, such as Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerman, and Jeff Bezos. America purports itself as a nation where everyone has the innate ability to become whatever they choose to be, billionaire included, if only they work hard to achieve their goals. While this philosophy may be technically true, individuals' rise from poverty is extremely rare, and our system stacks the decks against anyone attempting to move upward in economic status. Yet we send the message to hardworking people who juggle two jobs and struggle to survive that they are at fault for their own situations, that they have given up every opportunity to succeed. Martin Luther King, a socialist thinker as well, sums it up well in his quote, "It's all right to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps, but it is cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps." Why is it that the poor and disenfranchised are besieged with guilt and self-loathing, while those who sit atop of the food chain of wealth are celebrated? Why do we continue to embrace the false notion of the self-made billionaire? The fog of shame that emanates from our nation's culture of self-sufficiency and the notion that hard work and perseverance alone can enable anyone to lift themselves up by their bootstraps has a deleterious effect that not only impedes people from seeking help, but also sustains a culture of denial into the root causes of our society's ill. There are fans of capitalism who claim that the economic system that dominates our society today is not, in fact, capitalism at all, but rather a bastardized version of it, often termed crony capitalism. Jonathan Tepper's book, The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies and the Death of Competition, depicts our current version of capitalism as one that betrays every value of capitalism as it was intended. Tepper says that a chief problem with the status quo is a lack of competition that market consolidation and concentration has brought about. However, the foremost generator of inequality under capitalism is not markets, it's capital. Perhaps the problem isn't even so much the profits themselves, but who profits or how many share in those profits. One of the major differences we would see in a socialist society would be workers sharing in the means of production and having an equal ownership stake in the companies they work for. The edicts of capitalism suggest that competition is key and even natural. But let's look at the nature of competition. When parties are competing against one another, there is little room for cooperation, which means few incentives for protecting the common good. To compete means, by its own definition, an adversarial relationship where secrecy dominates, where the stakes of winning outweigh everything else. And of course, for there to be a winner, there must always be a loser. Cooperation, and not competition, I would argue, is the key to our survival. What if we focus our competitive nature on solving problems and making the world a better place? When asked if a socialist could be elected president of these United States, Senator Bernie Sanders replied, quote, "So long as we know what democratic socialism is, and if we know that in countries in Scandinavia like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they are very democratic countries, obviously. The voter turnout is a lot higher than it is in the United States. In those countries, healthcare is a right of all people. And in those countries, college education, graduate school is free. In those countries, retirement benefits, childcare are stronger than in the United States and of America. And in those countries, by and large, government works for ordinary people and the middle class, rather than as is in the case right now in our country, which is for the billionaire class," end quote. Whether you love him or hate him, Bernie Sanders is not wrong to say that the citizens of other countries have benefited greatly from the implementation of socialistic ideas into their societies. There are numerous examples of successful worldwide social programs that the United States could learn from, and not all of these advances hail from progressive European countries. For example, the Nicaraguan government launched and helped to finance a volunteer-based free literacy program back in 1980, which effectively reduced the country's overall illiteracy rate from 50% to 13%. Another Latin country, Chile, has a long history of socialist dabbling that I won't even pretend to be well-versed on, but that might make a topic for a future episode. While I'm not knowledgeable about the facts, details, and possible downsides, I do know that within the past decade, Chile did something right, to the point where the lowest citizens on the economic ladder were able to move up to a status that is akin to what we would call the middle class. I also know that the current president of Chile's Senate is also the leader of the country's Socialist Party, which aligns itself as center-left on the political spectrum. I guess in Chile, there is a position that's even further left of socialism. Now, by saying that the concepts and principles of socialism are worth exploring, I am not by any means professing that socialists always get it right. Throughout the world, past attempts to implement socialist societies have, in fact, resulted in failure. Two of the biggest and often very valid criticisms of socialism and its cousin communism are the totalitarian nature of past implementations and the inefficient systems of incentives. Rather than write off the entire idea of socialism, it seems logical to simply learn from the mistakes of the past and redesign a working model. Some would say this is impossible. Others would say it's obligatory. Christian Niemitz, the author of Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies, believes that socialists always have and always will use a phrase, "that was never true socialism," as a crutch to explain away failures in implementation. In the author's opinion, socialist projects do not start out with totalitarian aspirations. They just end up that way. Socialism is always democratic and emancipatory in its aspirations, but the oppressive and authoritarian in its actual practice. Kirsten explains that the successes of social programs actually fall into the category of social democracy, as opposed to, democratic socialism. My retort to this sentiment is a resounding, whatever. Call it what you like. Let's just make it work. I can agree with Kristen that adding the word democratic in front of socialism to make the movement seem more appealing is pointless, since all forms of socialism are by nature democratic. But really, I prefer taking action over arguing semantics. Whatever they call themselves, democratic socialists, socialist democrats, progressive leftists, or rainbow and unicorn dreamers, socialist ideas are steadily rising in popularity, and socialism has become a common point of interest. In 2012, for instance, the words capitalism and socialism were the two most consulted entries in the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary. Just a year earlier, a 2011 Pew Research Center poll measured sentiments towards different political labels and found that 49% of Americans aged 18 to 29 said they had a positive view of socialism, while just 43% said that they had a negative view. Now, the counter from my conservative friends, and some on the left as well, who have spent years decrying centrist Democrats with close ties to Wall Street, such as Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, as socialists, was a claim that the people who were polled had no understanding of socialism. Perhaps, but they did have an understanding of capitalism. They were living in it in the period after the financial meltdown in 2008. And they were interested in what was being floated as a socialist alternative. Another point of argument is that citizens being polled were all young, and socialism is a movement of starry-eyed, inexperienced, and gullible youth. Would these people give the same answer 10 years later? Well, according to a 2022 Pew poll, the overall number of people ages 30 to 49, both Republican and Democrat, with a positive view of socialism was 40%. Only 4% below the total of socialism fans 18 to 29. The age of socialist appreciation seems to be creeping upward as the stigma of communism and the Cold War fades from our memories. In the fall of 2013, when a young socialist was elected to the Seattle City Council, the news was all abuzz, sending shockwaves across the nation, even making news across the ocean. The New York Times dubbed Kshama Sawant a rare elected voice for socialism. While her win was indeed spectacular in the contemporary climate of American politics, in a broader historical sense, this was not remotely unusual. There have been hundreds and hundreds of socialists elected to local offices, and entire cities and townships have been founded and governed by socialists. And there are many successes in the concepts of socialism, if only we take the time to look. When we look to the 99% of society for their vision of what life ought to be, the one thing that we all share in common is a disdain for the status quo, where the people in power do everything that they must do to keep themselves in power at the expense of everyone else. Whether liberal or conservative, there is a general consensus that something is broken in our society, and we all want change. Robert Reich, professor, lawyer, cabinet member, political commentator, and most notably the author of many books on the economy and equality, states, if we don't want to live in a survival of the fittest society in which only the richest and most powerful can endure, government has to do three basic things: regulate corporations, provide social insurance against unforeseen hardships, and support public investment such as schools and public transportation. In essence, socialism, again, is a yearning for something better, a more just society, one that is more equal and ultimately more free and abundant with liberty. It's about affordable education, universal health care, livable wages, and the democratic control of both the workplace and society. It is the reckoning against an unjust and unfair society. Socialist thinkers reject the assumption that private businesses can, or ever do a credible job of delivering basic goods and services. We dismiss the notion that the free market is truly free and poses the best solutions to our society's problems. We hail public ownership, democratized workplaces, and environmental stewardship as the only humane and responsible alternative to rapacious capitalism. Instead of debating the merits of one economic system over another, the debate we need to be having is one that puts the focus on the betterment of society as a whole. With this definition in mind, I want to come out and say that I am a socialist. Granted, I may perceive socialism even differently from others who share my persuasion, but I am a socialist at heart, believing in the vision that the philosophy of socialism holds as its promise. I believe that the whole of our society needs to emerge from the slumber of economic starvation that has so thoroughly besieged our potential for compassion. I want to end my monologue with a quote from Victor Berger, America's first socialist congressman, circa 1906. We, the Social Democrats, do not simply want to make a noise like socialists. We actually want to do something as socialists. We want to be constructive and build up, not only destructive and tear down. Our socialism is not thunder, not simply hot air. It is lightning that strikes, purifies, and enlightens the world. End quote. And that, my friends, is the last word up front. I'm Sean Sainhart, and this is, of course, Coup Save America. I would like to extend a hearty welcome to my friend Adnan Husain. Adnan is a professor of medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world history at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Currently, he serves as the director of the School of Religion and oversees the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project. He is also the host of The Majais, I probably got that wrong, and co-host of Guerrilla History Podcast. And, of course, he is a regular guest on our favorite, The David Feldman Show. Adnan also hosts a weekly Marxist study group and is going to join us right after the break. And Adnan joins us right now.
Great to be with you, Sean.
Hi, thank you so much. I fumbled my way to that monologue as best as I could. So now, you have a study group, a Marxist study group that you host. What is your goal in doing that?
Well, firstly, I want to say that I think it's to achieve a lot of the things that you outlined in a brilliant monologue at the at the start. You really covered the issues, I think, and that is to move people to action by informing them a little bit more about how to analyze capitalism and how to understand a little bit better the roots of what we all feel like is a very oppressive system. We can't always quite put our finger on how it all works. We can understand our particular experiences, things that seem unfair or that seem wrong and should be corrected. But it's clear that the system is much larger than any one particular problem or one particular institution. And so how to have a more comprehensive understanding of what we're facing, I thought it would be useful because people were talking about socialism so much in the wake of the Bernie Sanders campaigns where he identified as a democratic socialist. The word, kind of came back, as you were just talking about, with a variety of different understandings, sometimes confusions, and of course loaded with a whole lot of historical weight that for especially older generations who lived through the Cold War, a lot of negative associations that led us to really think, well, why is this attractive? And I think you put your finger on something really important, which is that whether people understood or not, or had a very precise and educated understanding of the whole socialist tradition, they understood, as you said, capitalism quite well through their experience. And they realized they wanted something different, something fairer, something, just, something that, fulfilled their needs, and more than their needs, also their aspirations for a better world. So that's kind of the broad sort of sense of socialism as the alternative, as an alternative that's grounded in some kind of analysis of, how the economic order is organized and what the political consequences of that are. So, we started this informal group. I think there were many groups that started to read things like Karl Marx's Das Kapital, his critique of political economy, that is basically the mode of production that capitalism is, a kind of critique of Adam Smith and other economists who had articulated the theories justifying or trying to understand this new economic system that was emerging in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So we started reading that, and we ended up reading quite a lot of other works, both by Marx, by Engels, by other socialist thinkers, by, contemporary figures who have something to contribute, including, about, a perspective on capitalism's devastating effects on the environment. So, we're very concerned about these kinds of issues. Is there an approach or a perspective that could give us some sense of why it is that our whole way of organizing our economy and modern life seems to be just killing the planet? How and why is this happening? So those kinds of issues, I think, are present in everyday questions. I mean, this wasn't meant to be some, kind of inner sanctum for, academic and theoretical discussion on its own, just for the sake of it. But it was meant to be an opportunity for people to come together to talk about what they perceive in their worlds and see it reflected in socialist approaches, values, and philosophy, and to render and make that after gaining some political education, gaining some, theoretical analysis and insight. How do you put that into action by, figuring out in your own life, in your own workplace, in your own community, how things could be organized in a different way, and what you need to do in struggling, in solidarity with others who are suffering the same thing to change it. I mean, that's what Marx actually said rather famously in one of his works, the Theses, 11 Theses on Feuerbach. He said that, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. Like, they differ amongst one another. They've interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So Marx himself, in reading Marx, you're not reading some abstract thinker who's just pontificating about the ills of the world. His analysis was meant to enable us to change the world so that it would be a better place for all of us.
Now, tell us who Karl Marx is. Now, one of the arguments that I've heard people make is that, well, Karl was terrible with money and died in poverty and all of this stuff about. He was actually a brilliant philosopher, who I think. Now, is it fair to say that he's the father of socialism?
Well, actually, he's the figure or thinker who's most closely identified with the tradition of socialism. But, it's such a wide tradition, actually. He was just, one among many, thinkers who are wrestling with these issues of, how to respond to an industrial society that was changing very quickly, disrupting all the kind of traditional arrangements in society, whether it's land tenure, so peasantry being pushed off the land and forming a kind of urban poor increasingly, to factories and this new invention of the factory as a kind of system or as a place for production and the rapid changes in technology. So the world was changing. I mean, we think of ourselves as being in a fast-paced world. He was also responding to, as many others were, to a big change from essentially an agricultural society to one that was urban and involved in kind of production in factories and industry that was just changing the world. And so there were many different thinkers who were wrestling with how to deal with the evident immiseration of workers in this new system, where they had a certain kind of life as peasants or a small kind of tradesfolk and artisans under the guild system in the medieval era, or as peasants on the land. And they were forced into new social arrangements in order to survive that meant just absolute misery for them. So, people were working on this, and there were some utopian socialist thinkers. For example, a figure that Marx writes about and actually responds to and against as a figure representing this kind of utopian socialist orientation was like Robert Owen, a Welsh industrialist from the late 18th and early 19th century, who made a lot of money in the textile industry, but saw how devastating it was on the society as a whole. And so he was a social reformer and got interested in a lot of these ideas and started founding communities. Actually, he came into the United States and founded a utopian socialist community in New Harmony, Indiana. It didn't last for very long, but he was one among 30 or 40 such establishments that were created in the United States, on the East Coast, in the Midwest, in the early to mid 19th centuries. And these were communities that wanted to live otherwise, right? They wanted to live in a different way and have workers be the owners of their production, of making commodities and working together, and share those resources together collectively, and make decisions democratically for how they would organize that and organize their lives. So you could see that it was this kind of radical experiment. Experimental ideas were fermenting in the early 19th century in particular, that led to socialist thought. And there's lots of different streams in it. Marx and Engels are associated with what they called scientific socialism, that is really studying history and the mode of production to really analyze how a new system could emerge. That he didn't really think that you could just sort of absent yourself, in a small community like this and ultimately really create a successful change. He thought, the whole economy was organized around production of commodities, and the commodity system for the market was something that even if you found a different way to produce, but you were still having to supply to a kind of collective market, that ultimately the pressures on these experiments, these utopian experiments, would fail. So, Marx was writing, in the mid 19th century, about some different approaches and different ideas. And by the 1860s, he decided you really needed to take on this whole discourse about political economy, all these economic thinkers like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and so on, and really point out how the flaws in that system would lead to it creating a class of workers with a more revolutionary consciousness seeking justice, that he felt that this would have to happen. But what's interesting, and I think, when you were talking about Adam Smith in your monologue, what's very interesting is that, these capitalists or sort of proto-capitalist thinkers are the people the political economists who justified this new economic system and thought that, well, the difference between a feudal society is that you owed, your labor to your lord. It was part of the social obligation. But what happens under capitalism is better because a worker is completely free to make a contract to sell their labor, right? And it's a just system where they will pursue their self-interest on either side, and it will actually create a better society. The important point for me is that even these capitalist thinkers or political economists rationalized their theories justifying this kind of system by arguing that it would be good for society. Right. So,
Right.
That's sort of the issue here, is that it clearly hasn't been good for everyone in society. And the vast majority suffer from inequality. And when you have not had kind of movements to check the power of capital, we see the devastating, consequences. There are some periods in history where workers have organized and managed to make political change. In our country, for example, and we could talk a lot more about the history of these struggles, but of course, the great moment you have to look at is really, the New Deal during the 1930s and 40s under FDR, and see that as an attempt really to rescue capitalism from dire consequences of one of its crises, the Great, Depression, and that it put in place certain kinds of programs and protections, the kinds of things you mentioned. Robert Reich said, has to be done, basically. And for 30 years or so, that was the kind of dominant mode of institutions in American society. But without continuously protecting those, we've seen what's happened basically since the 1970s, is that inequality has grown radically and that wealth is being increasingly concentrated as these programs and protections get dismantled, because there's the political power of the wealthy. Because workers are increasingly not unionized and organized to fight for their rights in the system, what we've seen is an incredible concentration of wealth that would be impossible to imagine in the 1950s, for example. So that's the trend that happens, is that unfettered capitalism, the more it's deregulated, the system tends to increasing levels of exploitation and wealth concentration. So it clearly has failed in many ways. And, people really want an alternative. So going back to this tradition and actually maybe I would say completing the New Deal is something that really would captivate people. And I think that's what, Bernie's movement was really about. His goal in some ways was to complete the unfinished business of the New Deal and extend democracy not just to our political system. We have a democratic political system, but we can see its weaknesses when capital overwhelms and controls it and corrupts it. But that's why a real democracy is one that extends democracy and democratic principles of equality to the workplace, to other parts of life. Politics isn't completely separate and shouldn't be separate from our economy, our society. And that's really, for me, what socialism is extending democracy to economy and society so that you decommodify the necessities of a dignified, life, and actually create a real and genuine form of freedom that isn't just, certain political rights, but is actual freedom in a social and meaningful way. That, if you may have the freedom to sleep under a bridge as a homeless person, but that's not a real freedom, right? So that's the whole point, is that you're not really free if you're constrained by poverty, by, barriers, by racism. There's so many constraints that operate, and you can't really have a just, fair, and equal and free society until you dismantle those aspects of oppression under the system.
Now, so some might take what you. I guess I need to start my question by trying to get a definition, and I know this is difficult to do, of both capitalism and socialism in the simplest terms, and then lead into my original question, which is, so can capitalism then be reformed, or is it likely and possible that we can transition to something that is socialism in its entire construct? But like I said, I think that we need to understand capitalism and socialism in a more straightforward approach.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. And this is, of course, why somebody like Marx, who was interested in changing society for the better, felt that he had to really undergo a very serious study of capitalism and the way it operates in his 3-volume unfinished work, actually, Capital. And what he said, one thing that he said there that I think makes it very difficult to get a grasp on it, in the same way that socialism is hard to say, well, it is this. There's always differences, but also because these are complex phenomenon and they're always changing and updating themselves. And that's one of the key dimensions of capitalism, is that it develops, adapts, and has changed and had many different forms. The capitalism that we're dealing with now looks very different from, the capitalism of the mid-late 19th century. Some would argue, okay, so that means that original critique in Capital by Marx is just outdated. I mean, how could it possibly be describing the kind of finance capitalism and the techno capitalism, where, you have the commodification of all of our data. Everything that we do all the time online is somehow now a new commodity that can be, exploited. This is obviously something that was beyond the the imagination at the time. But I think there are some clear principles. One is understanding that, and this doesn't even come from Marx, that, that labor is alienated. Even David Ricardo and some of the, political economists understood that the basis of value was labor, and that labor was alienated from the worker in the sense that you could pay wages for it and therefore own the gains of production or the outcomes of that labor. So what you have is that, laborers, when they owned their own means of production, they were responsible for how they did their work and the outcomes of that work and any benefits, use, and profits of that work. What happened when labor became a commodity itself that the worker sold to the boss is that now they had no control, really. The contract that is supposedly a free contract is actually a huge constraint on the workers, because they now no longer have any control over how they produce, what they produce, and the value of what they have produced. And it is actually an unequal relationship. So that fundamental exploitation that we all know kind of in our guts, that really nothing happens without the workers. You don't have any industry, you don't have any technological development, you have no commercial creation of any products or services without the people who do the work. And yet, of course, they are not remunerated for the full value of that work. So that's basically fundamentally how capitalism works. I think one of the other kind of components about that is very significant, and why it changes so much in society, is that capital sort of feeds on itself. The way in which the system works is that finance and capital has to be present at the outset under the system of any production. And so in some ways, all production is organized around kind of, the dictates of capital, not human needs. And this is what leads us to things like environmental devastation, is because these other factors of social good, environmental, health, these things are all externalities to the dictates of capital, and they're not factored into it. There's no way in which you incorporate the social costs of these activities into the cost or the value of the commodity. So this way of organizing things around the dictates purely of capital and its own kind of expansion is really inhumane and dangerous. Fundamentally, it's like a cancerous sort of process that can be very much outside of the control of human needs and of society. And so I think that's something that has persisted throughout, even though capitalism has changed in many of its forms and stages. This continuous expansion in order to maximize capital, we've seen its progress through history and its devastating consequences on not only American society, but around the world as production has gone increasingly global.
So what would let's just say that socialism is worker controlled means of production, which we may need to explain for some people how that entails. But what would a socialist economy look like? Like, what would the workplace look like under socialism or under a socialistic model?
Well, I mean, I think it could look, like a few different kinds of things. It wouldn't just be, one model. And I think you were right to talk about, why am I blanking on it? Richard, the socialist economist.
Richard Wolff.
Richard Wolff, yes, of course. He's very fond of talking about the, possibilities of worker cooperatives as a way of organizing a workforce. There's a lot of different ways. I mean, obviously, what's most commonly associated with socialism is government control. And now that, for an American audience, sounds like that's the, if you think of the Reagan Revolution, what they managed to do in the modern Republican Party is really convince people that government was the source of the problem rather than a solution to them. I would beg to differ, but what it means is that there is public control. So when we say government owned, what we really should be talking about is public control. That is, there are some democratic direction, on behalf of the rest of society for directing the operation of that particular industry or business. That means that purely running for profit is not the only goal, but that there are social goods, or that it needs to fit the needs of society and be directed towards, some kind of democratic goal or agenda of prosperity on behalf of providing the services for the public at large. And this is something we see with utilities. Public utilities have been, great success in being publicly owned. They don't have to be always administered directly by the government. They can be a public corporation, or it could be administered in a different way. But the point is that these companies and corporations and enterprises are organized in such a way to deliver these services, but not to produce a profit that is privatized, right? So it's socializing the benefits instead of privatizing those benefits in the form of profits, because that's essentially what we're doing in this way. So I think there are a variety of models that run the gamut, from the more radical, it seems, decentralized sense of workers in their workplace organizing those enterprises, to larger scale, kinds of administering it in a, kind of corporate manner, but perhaps as a public corporation. When I said, decommodifying, that's the whole point, decommodifying the necessities of life. So the more realms of the necessities of having a dignified life that are actually under some form of public control. And by what I mean by that is that it should be socialized in the sense that the benefits are universal and on behalf of everybody. So when we say healthcare is a human right, what we really are saying is that it should be decommodified and taken out of the marketplace, where the fundamental goal is this is an enterprise for profit making and made into a social benefit for everyone, and it needs to be universal. Now, I would say that even chartered corporations, this is something Ralph Nader has made a big point of, is that corporations are all chartered. They're special. They're special kind of entities under the law that are given the opportunity to have legal personhood and various other legal benefits because there is thought to be a social benefit. And under these charters, state charters that license and allow corporations like this, they have to actually be for the public good or for the public benefit. And these should technically be reviewable. It's just that, these corporations have become so powerful that it's become natural for them to exist with no social responsibility or social check, and often very little, if any, regulation. So even in our system, there are resources for expanding. You don't have to radically kind of change everything and have every industry be a worker co-op to begin making progress on restraining some of the devastating effects of corporate capitalism in our system. So, I think there's a variety of models. I'm not, an economist to, really determine which of these is best, but I think the principle needs to be that you democratize the economy and socialize the benefits rather than privatize those benefits.
Yeah, I mean, so under socialism, I mean, we're not eliminating the idea of profits. We're simply, as you say, decommodifying the essentials of human life. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I mean, some people would go further and say ultimately you have to, decommodify all life, all aspects of living and productive activity, and everything we do should not be, organized around, sale or production for the market for the commodity as a commodity. But I think the most important sector is to say you have a right to housing. You have a right to health care. You have a right to work and to sustain yourself. There's some kind of key elements to living a dignified life that should be emphasized at the outset, because I think that's a broad message that we can agree upon. I mean, it's very popular, I think. Healthcare, publicly funded healthcare is very popular, for example. Free education is another one. The means of basically equipping yourself to live, a productive, healthy, happy life in a modern society. What are those key sectors? And it seems to me those necessities shouldn't be subject to the whims of, wealthy industrialists and the oligarchs of our society, the 1%. These are things that should be under the democratic control of 100%. I mean, let's include them, too. They're welcome to have free health care if they want it. So that's what I mean by decommodifying. Now, I think there are more radical, visions that would say that, once you've done that, and in fact, actually, once you've done that, where is the sort of realm for exploitative accumulation of capital that creates the inequalities and creates the oppressive system? It's pretty limited if like the necessities of life are socialized in that sense and decommodified.
Yeah. Now, I like to always tell people too that humans lived as socialists for hundreds of thousands of years as hunter-gatherers. That was essentially a socialist society, and the change was rather abrupt. I mean, it started with agriculture moving from hunter-gatherer to permanent housing settlements rather, and that's kind of where the idea of property, or what we know as capital, came into being. Is private property something that we have to consider, either changing in some way our understanding of it, or just abolishing the whole idea of it?
I think this is a really important point. I'm so glad you raised it also in this longue durée historical time frame. I mean, as a medievalist, so a scholar of pre-modern history, I always feel like it's helpful to see, in order to be able to understand what's actually really unique to our modern situation and what is shared, where the key changes have taken place, and also to recognize that so much of what we consider normal is a construct of human endeavor over time, and that little of it is natural or necessary, or the the order that has to be. I mean, and in fact, actually, a very important point is that this critique of the idea of private property actually goes very far back, and perhaps it is an inheritance of the vague transmitted memory, folk memory of eras before the establishment of organized societies based on kind of sedentary agricultural exploitation. Because if you see, for example, there are all these popular folkloric sorts of beliefs that you could live otherwise, and that hierarchical power is actually an invention, perhaps a necessary one, but certainly an inimical one to the hopes and aspirations of the majority. And so you have, for example, I'm thinking of a renegade priest in the English Rising of 1381 named John Ball. Sometimes it's called the Peasants' Revolt in England of 1381, which was a response to a lot of factors, including a poll tax that was being imposed upon people. People rose up and wanted change in the government. One of the kind of key figures ideologically was this priest, John Ball, and he preached to the rebels, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, right? So this hierarchical society that we have doesn't go back to organic original times, and there's always been this idea that we could hold things in common, and that private property was fundamentally the basis for oppressive power, because once you had private property, it needed to be defended against others encroaching. This leads to militarizing to violence, to hierarchy, and injustice, right? So there's always been this sense that private property was the real problem. And I think we do need to rethink it. We're not talking about, when you start talking about critiquing or having a different concept of private property, people immediately think that it means you can't own and possess or use anything that would be under your will. And of course, that is not what I think we mean when we talk about changing our idea of private property, but it is actually how the means of production, that's the kind of the crucial point, is how do we fulfill any of the necessities of our life in a modern society. I'm not talking about people who want to be survivalists, out in the wilderness and manage to eke out a narrow existence just on the land. But we're talking about a modern society. It requires cooperation. It requires a lot of integration and organization. So we are all mutually interdependent to one another in the division of labor in society. And so on some level, we're all taking part in producing for one another the quality and character of life. The means by which we produce that kind of life and the goods that we need in order to survive, food, clothing, and so on, the means for producing those could be socialized. That's, I think, the key point is that private property wouldn't necessarily, revising our idea of private property is not about removing the ability to clothe and house yourself. In fact, actually, these should be rights that are provided and decommodified for everybody's benefit so that everyone has adequate shelter, clothing, and food, and so on. But it means that the massive productive capacity needed to produce all of those food, clothing, needs to be in the hands of everyone. And in fact, actually, there's no way you can actually produce all of this stuff without everybody participating in some way by fulfilling some needs of goods or services for others. That's the nature of our interdependence in society. It's just that interdependence, which is a perfect rationale in some ways for socialism, and has been exploited inequitably for the benefit and control, really, of a few people. And when we think of that's what I really mean by democratizing the rest of life. We our economy and our society right now, we have a democracy, and you can send people to government. We have elections and so on, but that doesn't extend to other aspects of life that are so important. I mean, why is it that we have the most authoritarian regime in corporations, but we're supposed to live in a democracy when so much of your life experience is taking place in the workplace? You're not experiencing democracy and equality when your boss can fire you at any time. They can order you to do things that you don't really think are the right thing to do, or you will lose your job. I mean, that's not a democracy in my view. And I think fundamentally, if we revised our ideas of property so that we thought about it in terms of interdependence around the means of production, that would be, I think, a better way to free ourselves from kind of the consequences that even medieval peasants understood, that when you have private property around land, the means of sustenance, in that time, you end up having hierarchical, unequal society that's organized through, violent repression and suppression of the vast majority of people.
Well, and the other thing that I like to point out to people too is the idea of public property for the common good. I mean, right now we've seen the commodification of pretty much everything except for air at this point, and I'm sure that they'll figure a way to do that charge us to breathe at some point too. But I mean, if you just look like water, which is essential for life, how that has been commodified, and these things are inherently public by their nature. I mean, unfortunately, the whole idea of property, as you said, comes down to stolen assets, or what we've stolen.
Yes.
Through either war, pillaging, imperialism. I mean, the native lands, I mean, that was the original sin.
Yes.
Right there, which then led to slavery and so forth. So when we think of countries, I mean, we've in this society, we've just associated everything with property. Like, we own that, like that nation, these imaginary borders somehow. And we don't appreciate the fact that so much of nature.
You're listening to Citizens AM, KCAM Digital Radio.
Sorry. We'll be right back, folks. We're having some technical issues.
Thank you for being, and welcome to the Pineal Podcast. I'm
Okay, sorry about that, folks.
No problem.
That wasn't supposed to start until 4 o'clock. Okay, so I'm sorry. So the idea of natural resources versus the how has it gotten to even that point where we've commodified water?
Well, it is, I think, because even things that clearly have to be shared are part of the natural environment. If you can create a way in which you control access to it, you can create a situation in our system for turning it into a commodity, something that can be sold. Um, and I think that's the issue is that so much of what we need to survive has been turned into a commodity. I mean, that land, for one of the very biggest, changes that had such a consequent effect was turning land into a commodity. This is not a normal or natural thing to think that this land belongs to an individual, can be owned, uh, anything can be, done on that land, and that it can then be alienated, i.e., sold as a commodity. So, in fact, that's actually something that took a long time to develop. The idea that you could sell land, right? Because who are you to
Right.
sell it? You may be using it, you may have use rights, or society may distribute kind of access to it. And in fact, actually, one of the key transformations in removing the peasants from the land in order to create the surplus or floating kind of attached population in urban centers, to staff to work in the factories for the Industrial Revolution and for capitalism to really develop, was, of course, the famous privatizing of the commons. It wasn't a sense that there was a certain amount of land that even after land rights as property had developed, that historically there was the survival of certain parcels of land that was owned and held collectively, the commons. And what happened is that these were appropriated over the course of the late medieval and into the early modern period. And you have the enclosure acts that allow for and justify and legally recuperate those who essentially grabbed the land for private means, removed it from kind of collective control and ownership, and that undermined the ability of peasants to of peasant society at the time. So that's a really strange move in some ways. So land and other natural resources being turned over time increasingly into commodities that could be exploited for private gain and profit, has left us in the situation where you have the commodification and ultimately also the financialization, because once you have the commodity, then you can also do even more kind of instruments of selling and selling futures and so on. So you have the financialization. Once you turn something into a commodity, it is now removed from the public fundamentally and from the social. And that's why what I've been saying is that we need to look to decommodify as many things as possible, because the process of privatizing and commodifying, privatizing and financializing so many components of life and nature has gone so far. I mean, this isn't the only thing, but DNA and when you have indigenous peoples, for example, in the Amazon, who have developed all kinds of knowledge about plants and their uses over kind of eons and millennia, and then this is appropriated by large agribusinesses that then can, in this legal regime of private property, patent or, put a kind of intellectual, I think, this whole rise of intellectual property shows how the system has developed to be able to commodify as private property so many things. And so, you have people who have developed and produced this knowledge and this relationship to the land. They're being alienated from the very means by which they have lived for generations. This is something that we see. Nature and human culture, these are all being turned into commodities. So water is only just one among the infinite variety, and that is the kind of way in which capitalism operates. Is that it's an inexorable process in the pursuit of capital, that everything in life can and will be commodified and alienated from us and turned to the private benefit of the few.
Now, somewhere along those lines, earlier today, actually, on Facebook, I was having a conversation with a conservative friend who was responding to a post I had shared that was talking about inequality and poverty and how capitalism is inherently unequal.
Mm-hmm.
And the response was, well, but capitalism is what has provided so much of lifting people out of poverty and giving people eliminating homelessness and and such, and everyone loves to point out that socialism has always failed and that it's always resulted in like a dictatorship or totalitarianism or what have you. And I think, as you just pointed out, that we see that same system inherently in capitalism, except instead of it being the state, it's the corporation or the employer. Although ultimately they've captured the state at this point, I would
Yes.
say. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't even think that we necessarily have a democratic system of government, at least in the United States anymore. What would you say to that, in that critique that socialism has failed and that it's capitalism that has lifted
Mhm.
people out of poverty?
Well, I mean, firstly, historically speaking, socialist states and societies, have lifted people out of poverty. I mean, the transformations in Russia, China, even more recently, of course, in China, where there's been an active endeavor to try and lift people out of poverty. It's not that that has impoverished people. I mean, there are many reasons for why those societies failed, and of course, there are many critiques that we could offer about how socialist ideals were implemented in those states. But if we return, kind of to capitalism, I mean, it was never, for example, Marx's contention that capitalism had no positive or progressive benefits. I mean, in fact, actually, that was something that he understood by looking at the longue durée of history and transformation from feudal society to capitalist society, is that it dramatically transformed and enhanced the means of production. The ability to actually produce, to provide for society, was dramatically increased. What he thought, however, is that the fundamental exploitation involved in it would reach such a level that the developments, the productive capacities that had been developed, could be then turned to the benefit of all of society. So one of the most progressive, progressive in the sense that it changed society and enabled the means by which we might, according to Marx's theory and to socialist critiques, actually free ourselves and provide for all of our needs in a different way, is because capitalism has transformed productive and social relations in such a way. I mean, it has devastating and terrible consequences. And I think the environmental question is one that can we achieve a situation where we transform the system quickly enough on behalf of humanity before we kill ourselves and the rest of the planet. I mean, this is a real question, and Marxist ecologists and people who think about the ecology have a lot to say about how the limits of capitalism are being reached, because it can't continuously expand under the limitations of the environment. But so the point here is not that capitalism cannot and does not provide and create wealth. It does. It just very unequally distributes it. And it fundamentally, that unequal distribution relies on an unfair exploitation, of people. And you can see this. I mean, capitalism may have, raised the standard of living in the United States, particularly capitalism that was under great regulation with universal programs that had been established to smooth out the volatility of the crises that capitalism seems to produce very regularly through the New Deal, for example, and the same kind of transformations happening in Europe with the welfare state, in Europe that, dramatically regulated capitalism and socialized a lot of its benefits with these universal programs of education, health, and so on. However, the breakdown of this is really happening with the pitting, basically, of American workers against workers in other parts of the world, and the migration and the movement of capital always seeking greater profit and benefit and greater efficiencies. Is that it doesn't, the owners, the capitalist class, the oligarchs, they don't care, and they don't need to care about the society in which they developed and which may have raised the standard of living for a period of time. But when there is the opportunity, because productive capacities have started to change and get developed in some of these developing nations, where they now have a workforce that can be more quickly trained to do this on a much cheaper basis, then, they will move and devastate this society, going to places like, Detroit and so on, where industry has left and collapsed, the social economy. So it's not that capitalism doesn't produce wealth. It's just that it's producing wealth not for human social benefits and needs. It's for its own logics and for the benefit of the few. And eventually, you reach the limits of the exploitation, of the oppression, and there has to be, the inequality is just grows and grows. I mean, that seems to be the tendency in the United States and in every place where unfettered capitalist activity takes place. So it is a dynamic force for change that produces wealth. But that ultimately the seeds of all of the problems are greater than the productive capacity. So that's why it has to, these means of production that are produced in this capitalist stage of human social development then need to be socialized so that we can have a fairer and just world. And it doesn't mean that you would lose the productive capacity or that you would lose the innovation and the ability to have a creative and dynamic form of life. It's just that now that would be a creative and dynamic life that we all are participating in for our own needs in a democratic and equal sort of manner.
Well, and I would even argue, too, that we're stunting innovation by just merely oppressing so many people that don't have the opportunity to bring their ideas into the mainstream. This in America, it seems we've created this mentality that you ought to want to be a billionaire, and that it is possible to even be a billionaire. And someone along the lines of our conversation about private property is the idea of, at what point is enough enough? I mean, should we not, as a society, put a cap on wealth in some way?
Well, we definitely should. In fact, we really need to, because the kind of political power and control, and even beyond politics, just the control and power that such extreme wealth allows is dangerous for society. We've seen with Twitter, for example, having a billionaire control a major mechanism for public discourse and communication, at the whims of, one billionaire who has control over, anything that could happen with this means or this mechanism. Many people have built, businesses and enterprises around the ability to communicate on social media. I mean, tell me a business that doesn't rely in
Yeah.
some fundamental ways now on using social media, but yet these platforms that really function now as public utilities are privately owned. And it just accords these people who control them with incredible amounts of power over our society, not just even in that direct way, but of course also in promoting their views and ideas, so that they have such incredible and undue influence. So it's not just a ressentiment of people that, oh, we resent the fact that, oh, somebody has so much more than us. It's that it is socially dangerous. It is politically dangerous. The health of society is very much at risk when you have a few people exercising such incredible power as a result of their wealth.
You mentioned that Karl Marx was a scientific socialist. And then there's also the utopian version of socialist. There's a TV show that someone suggested I watched in preparing for socialism, and it's a show called Amsterdam, which is about a hospital that's pretty much just imagine run by a guy that's like Bernie Sanders. And every episode, there's always some capitalistic problem that they're solving within this hospital, and it all looks so simplified and. Well, I would argue that the message of what's possible, I find inspiring. It's just the way that the show and everyone else seems to portray socialism as this geeky sort of pie in the sky, dreamy, thinks that unicorns are flying around. This utopian model that utopia is impossible and that socialists are just sort of wacky in a sense that yeah, you think you mean well, but it can never happen. It's impossible. What would you say to that criticism? Because it seems to me that we're at a crossroads in society where capitalism certainly cannot sustain itself. And so the question is what comes after that? And we can either have something that we design ourselves, or I think it's going to end up in an actual state of fascism.
That's right. I mean, that is sort of the classic choice, socialism or barbarism, right? And that's, it seems increasingly what we're facing now. And in fact, I think one of the only antidotes to the rise of right-wing, extreme nationalists, proto-neo-fascists, globally. I mean, because it's not just in the United States, of course. I mean, we're lucky that, Jair Bolsonaro was voted out and Lula da Silva, is taking government. We can see that, there are right-wing forces that also no longer want to accept democratic decisions and the outcomes of elections. I mean, that seems to be a fundamental program. And that was also the case in the 1930s, the fascists, Nazis and others, they were not Democrats, right? So we're seeing that globally happening in Europe, and it seems to me that there is something that people are terming right-wing populism, which I think is fundamentally a contradiction in terms because, it is not populist in the sense that it, ultimately provides for the social and democratic will of the people, but it is couched in nationalist sorts of terms on behalf of the people against, elites and so on. The only real antidote, liberalism and centrist kind of capitalism just has no answer for this phenomenon. And ultimately, just as it has historically in other contexts, it will make its peace with fascism if it's a choice of, genuine socialism or fascism. That's, I think, something that, is a real concern and a real danger. But I think the only actual force politically and socially that can counter the right-wing rise is an organized left. And actually, Bernie Sanders gave an amazing speech that unfortunately barely got covered in 2020 when he was running, for the 2020 election, um, which was, talking about democratic socialism. He had sort of adopted the term. I'm with you. I don't think the term has to matter that much. And actually, in a way, I wish he had just said, I'm an FDR Democrat and we're going to continue the New Deal. But he felt like, okay, I need to explain what socialism means to me. What is democratic socialism? He gave this extraordinary speech that really did invoke FDR's legacy. But he also talked about how there were Nazis. This is not there were Nazis gathering, in Madison Square Garden, as a result of the devastations of the Great Depression, and of course, as a response and reaction, the Know Nothings to immigration in the early part of the 20th century. You had these kind of right-wing forces crystallizing in a pro-Nazi kind of movement that was meeting in Madison Square Garden. And he said, the only thing that stopped the United States from potentially going fascist, like other countries did, go fascist. And we have a history of terrible expropriation, of dispossession, of in genocide against the indigenous, the history of the enslavement and subsequent of Africans and racism. We have a lot of historical resources, you might say, for a fascist turn, right? So why didn't we end up taking that path? And he made the point that it was because of the New Deal. It was because essentially of democratic socialism being implemented on a grand scale to apply universal programs to cushion the blow of this Great Depression and lift people up out of poverty, give them some sense of stability, which is the importance of the social insurance of the Robert Reich point, is that, the sense of the fragility of your life goals and aspirations in this system, because one, serious illness could just destroy you financially, or lead you to die, or the fact that you may lose your job. It's so easy to be fired. And so that precarity, that feeling of being precarious on the edge, actually makes people turn towards what are the sureties? What can I count on? What is something that's going to protect me? And some people fall back into these ideas of, we need to protect our ethnic or racial or some kind of fictive kind of identity, of going back to how America was when it was great, etc. It leads people to turn towards authoritarian and fascistic kinds of movements as a way to resolve these anxieties and these instabilities. And so the only thing that can really resolve those are not, the liberal centrist, if you just get a better education and compete in the marketplace, things will be fine for you. And if you don't, well, hey, that's your problem. And you have to be, kind of take responsibility yourself. There's no kind of universal imagination here of how do we protect everybody by giving everybody health care, these universal programs. That's the only thing that can really counter the temptations and the attractions in a dissolving system where we've been exposed to the rollback of all these regulations and protections, the neoliberal, kind of globalized economy has been devastating for people, and people feel on the edge. The 2008 financial collapse. We've had one kind of financial and economic blow after another, with very little done to support common working people, instead of supporting, even during the COVID pandemic, trillions of dollars going towards corporations and very little to support, working people. So there's going to be all kinds of dislocations and potential radical turns. It seems to me the only way to ensure that the rise of this right-wing populism is actually countered is through socialism.
And thankfully, we've got a socialist president, Joe Biden.
The greatest leader of, the supporter of labor in our history. It's unbelievable.
But that shows the disconnect, right? That the fact that we've got right wing, I mean, Fox News conservatives, Joe Biden's a socialist. That's so far from the spectrum of reality as far as to what socialism is. And yet it's been portrayed in that way. And so it almost does give this utopian sort of vision of socialism as that just is, I mean, Republicans have this idea of it that is so far from reality. Even most Democrats seem to have a very disproportionate reach of socialism. I mean, when we're calling, and it's funny because we heard Bernie Sanders described as a socialist by both the left and the right, and Joe Biden, of course. So, yeah, the term has almost become as meaningless as the term capitalism.
Right.
So,
Right. I mean, and as you said, I mean, even Harry Truman, already argued that like any progress that's made on behalf of people to give them security or support is called, socialism or communism. So I guess, I would say we should put forward the policies and the programs and the vision, and who cares what they call it,
yeah.
Either we have to embrace that and say, if you want it, if you want to call it socialism, fine, but this is just taking care of people in our society, and it's actually popular. I mean, it seems to me that there's too much thinking and worry about how it plays politically, the use of the term. In the end, they're still going to claim, they claim Joe Biden's a socialist. I mean, we wish he were.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, we wish he were. I mean, it's just, I don't know. We have to have a little bit more courage, it seems to me, and wisdom, that we don't need to argue about the term, but we have to have courage that if somebody, for advocating for Medicare for all, free college, all these things that we've been talking about, a Green New Deal, etc., we can't be afraid on behalf of the policies that we really think would help everybody and change this society for the better, about what will be called. I mean, that seems to be the idea, is that if we go too far in advocating for these policies that are popular and good ideas, that will elicit this reaction from the right, where we'll be accused of socialism, of being too radical, etc. They're going to do that anyway, because they have no reason, not to condemn any move at this point to improve the lives of working people on behalf of, corporate interests. That's just comes with the territory and the kind of cravenness I mean, I don't like to engage in all of this excessive and vitriolic condemnation of, the few progressives who happen to have been elected into, Congress or other parts of government. But what I would hold up as an example that I wish others would follow is somebody like Kshama Sawant, who you mentioned in your, in your monologue. That is somebody who has managed to achieve quite a lot of change and policies of benefit to working people, despite having a democratic establishment, the corporate interests that dominate Seattle, whether it's, Starbucks or Amazon. She has had incredible gains, and those are rooted in a fighting approach that doesn't shrink from the confrontation of making the case, and is backed by social movements and organizing and alliances in community groups, so that it's not just an individual politician trying to advocate something, but that they are backed by an organized left. That's what we've been really lacking. And that's, I think, my greatest fear in attempting to confront the rise of right-wing, fascistic, right-wing populist movements, is that we are not equipped really to provide that counter view and to confront those forces, because we're not very organized. I see some hopeful signs in labor struggle that has emerged, especially after the pandemic. Starbucks, Kellogg, John Deere workers, Christian Smalls, and the Amazon, initiative to unionize in Amazon, the rail workers. Even before the pandemic, we had some wildcat strikes in places like West Virginia among teachers. These are hopeful signs. What's lacking is some kind of coordination and too much deference in some ways to the political leadership within the Democratic Party. That is a recipe, it seems, for frustration that will allow the right wing to capitalize upon populist anger, justifiable in many ways because of the inequities in the economy, but very much in bad faith with no solutions and no real genuine interest in Tucker Carlson may go on and make all these criticisms of corporate elites because he sees them as liberal, and that's his target, is the elites. He's driving this kind of populist discourse against elites that he identifies with, liberals and socialists and so on. But he will not be advocating for labor unions, right? On his show and his channel. And so that the whole point is that we do have the solutions to protect workers. Every working person knows that they're stronger, when they have 100 people asking for something than one person going and asking the boss to give them an accommodation, give them sick days, etc. They're not going to do it out of the, goodness of their hearts. They have a bottom line. The dictates and logics of capitalism prevent on a system-wide level this being any kind of possibility for a solution. The only solution is to confront that power in the workplace with the collective power of the workers, and you do that through a union. So I have some hope that the rise of more radical unions, not the kind of corporate unions that made their peace with management and had these ideas of collaboration and cooperation and have been co-opted in many ways, but actually driven by rank and file interests and their experience of being frustrated by the exploitation, their suffering. That I have some hope that could be the basis for organizing the left again in some coherent fashion. But I am quite concerned about even some of the people who may identify as democratic socialists not taking the kind of fighting stance and realizing that their effectiveness really results and flows from being accountable to a social movement. There's no real accountability and connection to those social movements in the way that we see in Seattle with Kshama Sawant. That should be a model for us for effective political organizing that I think we've been ignoring.
That's interesting because that brings up what we just saw too, sort of with the Speaker of the House race, where a very small contingent of right-wingers were able to basically hold the process hostage and able to get concessions. And I would even argue that some of the concessions that they got, I agree with. Limiting the Pentagon budget, things
we'll see about that one. I mean, I really hope that is the case.
I doubt. I think that, as you say, that's all bluster. But why the progressives? I mean, I'm talking about what's referred to as the Squad had a chance to do something very similar with Nancy Pelosi, and yet they chose not to. They chose to sort of go along with the Democratic Party, not ask for many concessions. Why is it that we're so afraid on the left to put up that fight and to fight for what we believe?
I think because we're not an organized, coherent social movement. I mean, there's so much fragmentation, infighting. There isn't a kind of sense of the priorities and strategies and leadership of, politically elected representatives are not in a way, genuinely connected and accountable to those movements, because I think that they would feel, people, feel bolder, and just the same as the union example, an individual worker. I mean, if you feel much more emboldened to advocate for what you want and to make your demands, if you're supported by a large group of other people who, have your back. And I think that's the problem, is that we've disconnected the political dimension from, organized social movements and campaigns in communities. This is something that even, Ralph Nader is not a radical thinker. Okay. He is, from my mind, he's a brilliant man who's made so many incredible contributions, but he is somebody who really works within what he sees as available within the system. I mean, he's not saying throw it all, and overturn it. He's saying use the law, use some citizen action and organizing. He makes the point that these congressional representatives have moved further and further away from actually being engaged with and accountable to their constituents in democratically organized forums where there would be some kind of communication, town halls, these sorts of community centers. They come for the photo ops. There's, outreach to them in that way, but they're only accountable at election time. And there's no, you may write to your congressperson, but there, what you need is an organized kind of way of expressing that there is a group that has certain concerns and interests, and they're making these demands, and they constitute a political force in the community. That's something that we need to do, much, much more of, it seems to me, even within the system. I'm not saying that will lead to incredible transformation. I mean, that's what's contained within the political system of a representative republic, representative democracy, a republic that we have. But even the tools that we have available to us, I don't believe we're using in the most organized and intelligent fashion. And when I look to see what Kashama Shawant and her social movement and her organization is capable of achieving in a place like Seattle as the lone socialist on the city council, I think that should really be inspiring. We should take some lessons from that, try and apply these in other contexts. I was very disappointed as well that what little power is available by the circumstances of a narrow majority in Congress in 2021 wasn't used to some productive effect. I mean, I don't know if a floor vote on the House for Medicare for All is the most effective demand, but there were demands to be made. We can clearly see that the Republican dissidents here have managed to come up with a whole host of procedural issues. But even more importantly, on some level, there was a lot of hope and optimism. Of course, people were disappointed with the defeat of Bernie Sanders in the primary. However, there were some gains of Democratic Socialist progressive Congress people who were elected. There was some hope that they might carry forward that agenda into the next session of Congress. And even if it isn't going to achieve these outcomes initially that everybody's hoping for, you are signaling to that social movement, to that base, that we are connected with your concerns and demands, and we will fight. That itself is inspiring in generating more support, more attention, and all of that energy that could have been recovered and directed for the last couple of years when was absolutely necessary during the pandemic on some of these important must-pass bills where very little was achieved. No $15 minimum wage, very little support, not even like temporary health care during the COVID period. There were a lot of asks that could have been made. We defeated ourselves, it seems, by not making use of the limited power that was available to gain more power and gain more credibility, that there are all of these people who are backing the squad when they make these demands. I mean, they could have made a public kind of case for it, and we could have flooded, Congress with like support and shown that there is a real appetite for change now and the progressive policies that we've put people into Congress for, and that would have itself generated, it seems to me, more of a fighting kind of spirit to have some further gains down the line when must-pass legislation came forward. But once you capitulated at the best opportunity that you had, I think it was easy to see that you could kind of intimidate progressives, isolate and marginalize them, make them feel alone, fragmented, because they didn't coordinate with one another. They weren't coordinated with the social movements and the interests of the populace, the progressive populace, the left community at large. And so, of course, when you're isolated and marginalized by the institutional powers, the establishment, you will feel weak and that there isn't anything you can do, and that your best strategy is to accommodate yourself within that structure for the occasional, mostly symbolic gains that don't really resonate with people. So I agree with you that I think it was an opportunity missed. And what's even worse in some ways is not taking the lesson now that we're seeing that it can be wielded in this fashion for, you point out that there are a few good things in there. There are, of course, also some horrible things in there. And I don't believe that this group is necessarily, they're performing, to gain a kind of attention. They may have also personal problems with, there are certain components and dimensions to their motivations and what they're trying to achieve that I don't think we would want to imitate or take on board. But nonetheless, they are showing that when there is political leverage, it really needs to be used. And we will see whether the media kind of, scolding or decrying what they're doing actually leads to political weakness down the line. I have a feeling it's not going to. I have a feeling that the populist anger is actually going to look to these people who have enhanced their reputation for at least being willing to fight against a system that seems rigged against the common person. To me, this is dangerous that the left is ceding that kind of, kind of discursive and political power to communicate to working people that they care about their concerns and are willing to fight for them.
Well, what we're seeing too is the illusion of diversity throughout government and throughout these institutions, and also the illusion of unity. The fact that Republicans they're remarkably united around the central issues. I mean, they know what to fight for. They know what their base supports. The Democratic Party and this whole big tent ideology that they profess, which is not even really true. I mean, it's a big tent for corporations in the interest of Wall Street. And so politically, it seems the Democrats, forget about the neoliberalism, but the Democrats just seem to be almost in a state of delusional, a comatose type situation where they're denying the political climate that exists right now and pretending that things are fine. Whereas at least the Republicans are using manifested anger to, make these outrageous demands and get these concessions. I mean, it just seems like Republicans are willing to fight and acknowledge the general discontent in society, whereas Democrats don't. I mean, I don't understand.
I agree with you that it is disconcerting to see that, and as I was saying, I think it is dangerous because it will siphon away people. There's a certain kind of group on the left that are very reactive in some ways and very anti-liberal. Like the main thing is this criticism of these liberal, the liberal establishment. I also really have deep problems with them. However, the issue is that a lot of those people can easily move in this kind of polemical, kind of reactive sort of mode into, affiliation with the right, step by step, because that anger, that reaction, that willingness to fight is present there against, this liberal establishment. We have to be smarter, and we have to work quite a lot harder, and remember, what it is, why it is we're fighting. We're not fighting to be right. We're not fighting for anything. We're fighting, to improve, our society, and because of our principles. And so I think it would really be helpful if perhaps we reconnected with the legacy of somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, we're concerned about the fascism, and that seems to be, in some ways, the Democratic Party's new brand is just like, well, we keep out the fascists. I don't believe they can and will, but that is sort of we're not the fascists, so you've got to vote for us. But MLK gave a great speech called "The Three Evils," one of the last speeches that he gave near the end of his life before he was assassinated. Assassinated, by the way, of course, engaged in a labor struggle.
Yes.
Very important to remember that. What is it? The Memphis sanitation workers in Memphis. He said the three evils of our society that we have to combat, and I think these are so relevant for now as well, are racism, poverty, war. These are the three evils. And right now, I don't see the Democratic Party fulfilling these legacies at all. We need to refocus it around fighting for equality, the end of bigotry against racism. And, that's very important right now with the right wing mobilizing kind of anti-immigrant, kind of white nationalism. We hear, this being talked about openly now, about a Christian nationalism, which is just a kind of way of saying on some level, perhaps, white Christian nationalism, that they're working for. That has to be confronted. Okay, so maybe some of the liberals will be allies in that fight. However, we need to recruit them to the fight against the ills of poverty. We've been talking about the whole time about, class oppression, and also the last component that I think is also really being ignored in the Democratic Party now is the tradition of being against war. I mean,
I know, yeah.
What has happened, to this heritage of being the anti-war party? Instead, they're just as foaming at the mouth for militarism and, military interventions around the world as the neocons, were under Bush. And this is truly disturbing, and that is also fueling this kind of right-wing isolationist turn. That they have that tradition. They already have that kind of anti-Wilson's, 14 points tradition from the early 20th century of America Firstism. So the only way we can combat this seems to me that kind of model of democratic socialism that comes from MLK, of identifying these as the three evils of our time, just as much as they were the evils of his in the late 60s, which is depressing to think about it, that we've made rather little progress on some levels. But we need to also, I was also dismayed by, speaking of the anti-war component, that even the tepid calls with a lot of support for Biden's policy and congratulating him on, an even-tempered kind of balanced set of policies, simply a small, tepid kind of tentative call for wouldn't some diplomatic negotiations be appropriate now, got shut down so quickly, and that the progressives themselves were so frightened by the prospect of criticism and backlash that many of them withdrew from that congressional letter from the Progressive Caucus. So I know that's a whole other topic about, anti-war, but that's a real socialist. I mean, Eugene Debs, he sacrificed because he took a principled stand against involvement in World War I, against what he saw as an imperialist war.
And we've had,
yeah, exactly. He went to prison, for those beliefs, all through, the 1960s, of course, against the Vietnam War. But to see now that the left is really kind of confused now about where it stands on militarism, U.S. imperial intervention abroad, and fomenting, not standing with conviction for peace seems to me a big mistake. And the right wing is actually capitalizing on the unwillingness of the left to really organize itself around a progressive anti-war movement, not a America First resentment that money is going abroad. This kind of point. It's true that we need to be spending more on society here, but they're also putting in cuts, for social spending and social programs at the very same time. So this isn't a genuine program of being anti-war, but it is exploiting, the unpopularity of extended U.S. intervention and involvement around the world. That's something that has to be confronted, and that is a real socialist principle as well.
Well, and also too, the part of this whole interventional strategy in these wars, people love to point to all of these countries where socialism has failed, not realizing that U.S. military interventionism is in part designed so that they fail in order to sustain our capitalist system.
Absolutely.
I mean, can you give some recent example? I mean, I'm surprised, quite frankly, with Lula and the United States supporting Lula. I'm wondering what kind of upside down world we're living in here. But I find that Lula's win highly inspirational.
Yeah.
And a good sign. And he's someone that I would identify heavily as socialist. And he himself lifted many of his people out of poverty when he was president the first time. So what do you make of that? I mean, the idea that socialism fails because the United States has an interest in it failing, in contrast to all of a sudden we're seeming to support a socialist movement.
Yeah, I mean, Brazil is such an important country, that having a progressive or socialist leader there, on the continent who could also perhaps help organize, there's been some talk actually, and we'll see how far the support for Lula extends if he does more than just, appoint a minister for indigenous affairs and put in a real environmentalist in the interior ministry for, protecting the Amazon. But if he goes to the point geopolitically of challenging, U.S. hegemony by organizing, I'm forgetting the name of the organization. Is it maybe OAS, Organization of American States? I'm trying to remember it, but there was some talk that he was thinking of actually creating a kind of common currency for South America. I forget the name that was being floated, but there is like a name. These are actually conscious plans, and he has talked about how there needs to be more coordination. That I think would be a bit of a challenge. We would see if that changed U.S. policy. But I think the specter of Bolsonaro as such an affiliate of Trump and of other far-right movements led these kind of centrist, liberal governments, corporate kind of governments, whether it's France or Britain or the United States, to express disquiet over a possible kind of coup attempt. So I don't know if I would conclude that this is fundamentally support for Lula yet, until we see what his agenda will be politically and legislatively and geopolitically. But what we can say, I think, at this stage is that essentially this is an anti-Bolsonaro, Trump and anti-fascist kind of position that is being taken by these countries, which will always be the case at this stage, until the left shows that it's actually going to radically change society on behalf of working people in these dramatic ways and challenge U.S. Imperialism and, kind of the worst ravages of capitalism. Then we may see, something different emerge in U.S. policy toward Lula.
Well, or even hopefully just here in our own country. Because I mean, a lot of the again, just the idea that socialism has failed doesn't account for the interventionism the United States seems to employ in order to keep that. And part of that is in our political system with the corporate-owned government, really. I mean, it's both parties. It's not just the Democrats.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I would recommend, anyone who's interested in this to read pretty good, really excellent, actually. Pretty recent book by Vijay Prashad called Washington Bullets. And it is essentially about the U.S.'s suppression of populist socialist movements, since during the era of the Cold War and even after, and how many occasions there have been where popular social movements have been disrupted, sometimes through the assassination of their important charismatic leaders, or through other means and mechanisms of disrupting the gaining of power or the success when once in power of regimes, of governments that intended to nationalize important resources like oil. Mossadegh in Iran is, of course, a well-known case of the British and the U.S. Involvement to overthrow that government and reinstall the Shah, and other cases since then of popular movements coming to fruition. I mean, we had, of course, Bolivia not so long ago, of a kind of a sort of coup. And in fact, actually, the foreword is from oh gosh, why am I'm blanking on the name of the sort of deposed leader, but the first indigenous person of indigenous background to have achieved a high political position like that to lead the country. So that's a very recent one. I mean, we've seen that happening with the sanctions regimes also, that the United States, even if it doesn't actually work directly to overthrow the government, or in these cases more during the Cold War, or in late Cold War in Latin America, where there might have been assassinations and so on, like Allende, in Chile, collaboration, which is well established now that there was knowledge and coordination of various kinds, that even when they haven't done that, they've isolated and imposed sanctions ever since, of course, Cuba. But that's not the first and last time. Venezuela is under various kinds of sanctions meant to strangle its economy, and we've seen that technique imposed of unilateral U.S. sanctions on many countries in the Middle East, whether it's Syria, Iran, Iraq, and so on, that has caused real devastation and prevented these societies and countries from developing, meeting the needs of their people, and of actually developing a lot of these countries that had achieved over the 50s, 60s, and 70s some level of increased standards of living, greater education, better healthcare, and so on. Those gains have been dramatically unraveled because of U.S. Imperial interventions and sanctions. And the sanctions regime, I think, is very important. On Guerrilla History, a podcast that I co-host, we've been having actually a series on case studies of U.S. sanctions, and we've looked at Iran, we've looked at Cuba, And we have upcoming episodes as well. So if people are interested in how these work in general as a system to maintain U.S. Dominance and isolate these countries, to promote, in some cases, regime change, and how they have caused a great deal of suffering and harm to peoples around the world, so they could check out that series on guerrilla history.
Yes, great podcast. And you also are the host of the Magi. I'm probably
the Mudsless, right? Yeah, the Mudsless.
Yes, sorry
yeah,
about that. And you regularly are featured on the David Feldman Show.
I am.
In fact, I have great admiration for you. I've been a little bit not clear-headed because I've been intimidated. I'm so honored to have you as a guest, and I've learned so much from our discussion that I didn't even know.
Well, I have had a really wonderful time, and you have a lot of not only great questions that show, the acumen that you have politically in thinking about these things, but also I really think your monologue really said it all. I mean, we've just been elaborating on what you put forward in your opening statements that I think was very effective in communicating. The option of socialism and why it is popular. So I hope many people are convinced, if not by my ramblings, at least by what you had to say at the outset.
Thank you so much. And again, so where can people find Guerrilla History and the Modulus?
Well, you can find both of them on pretty much any of the major podcast platforms, whether Google or Apple, Spotify, and so on. Guerrilla History is with 2 R's and 2 L's. Just there are alternate spellings. You won't find us if you don't put in double R's and double L's. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Adnan A Husain, Husain. I'm always eager to hear from people, to learn more through interaction and contact with people. So please feel free to follow me, and I will follow back.
And I'd love to have you back, because I would love to talk about Middle Eastern history. Your real forte. So hopefully you'll come back. And I want to thank everybody for listening and watching. And we'll see you next Tuesday.
I often think about the way you think about when we're old. I always thought that we could be the greatest story ever told.